The bell of the small church in Dry Creek tolled slowly, its notes dragging across the dusty hills. A sound that should have announced celebration now rang like a sentence. The cracked stained glass windows spilled shafts of red and gold, painting the worn pews with wounds of light. The air was heavy with dust, sweat, and wildflowers already wilting in their jars. Margaret walked down the narrow aisle, her plain white dress cutting through the gloom. Each step felt torn from the earth, as though the floor itself resisted carrying her forward. The veil, thin as spider silk, quivered with her held breath. Some smiled faintly as she passed, but most only watched in silence, their eyes fixed like spectators at an execution. At the altar, the priest fumbled with a parchment that shook as much as his hands. His lips moved in prayers too soft to hear. Then Margaret's father rose from the front pew. His face bore the lines of drink and debt, his eyes clouded with shame. With a sharp motion, he snatched the document from the priest and held it aloft for all to see. "There will be no wedding," he declared, his voice rough, heavy with disgrace. "My daughter will pay my debt today." A murmur swept through the church, rising like wind through a canyon. Women covered their mouths, men glanced at one another, and a few laughed in disbelief. Margaret froze midway down the aisle, her veil trembling like a candle about to die. Her eyes locked on her father's, blazing with the fury of betrayal. The back doors creaked open. The cattle baron entered, his black coat gleaming, his waxed mustache curved like a blade. His polished boots struck the wooden floor with the weight of a judge's gavel. He moved down the aisle with the arrogance of ownership, his thin smile cutting the room in half. "The agreement is made, Mr. Briggs," he said smoothly, taking the parchment. "Your daughter belongs to me." The congregation gasped as he opened the contract. There, beneath the trembling signature, a dark stain spread across the page. Dried blood, a seal of shame, an invisible shackle. The priest stumbled back, whispering a prayer, but the baron only chuckled. "What is more sacred than blood, Reverend? This seal binds her tighter than any vow." Margaret lifted her chin, the veil hiding her face but not the fire burning in her eyes. Around her, the altar flowers seemed to wither faster, as though they too recoiled from the bargain. The sacred ceremony had been twisted into an auction, and in the shadows at the back of the church a man in a low-brimmed hat watched. He did not laugh. He did not move. He only stared, his silence heavier than chains, a presence that stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. The baron unfolded the contract with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the spectacle. The parchment cracked as it spread open, each crease sounding heavier than iron. The words, written in bold strokes of ink, glimmered under the fractured light of the stained glass. Yet it wasn't the letters that made the congregation lean forward. It was the dark smear at the corner of the page, a stain, dried and cracked. "Blood. Signed and sealed," the baron announced, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Debt paid, property transferred." The priest faltered, his breath quickening. Sweat glistened across his brow. This is not the work of God, Mr. Barrow," he whispered. His voice wavered like a candle about to gutter out. "But it is the work of the law, Reverend," the baron snapped, slamming the parchment onto the altar. The thud cracked through the church like a whip. "And the law in Dry Creek bows to those who pay." All eyes turned to Margaret. Some were laced with pity, others with satisfaction, but most were blank, resigned. Her dress, once a promise of future and devotion, now seemed more like a burial shroud. She held her chin high, though the invisible chains of the contract already pressed against her skin. Her father leaned toward her, lips trembling. "I had no choice, child," he muttered, low enough for only her to hear. Margaret's reply was a blade. "There is always a choice." The baron retrieved a silver inkwell from his coat, setting it upon the altar as if it were sacred relic. From another pocket he withdrew a steel pen. He extended the parchment toward her, his grin curling sharp. "Just a formality," he said. "Your mark here, my dear, and the whole town will know you are mine." The silence thickened. The shuffle of boots, the stifled sobs of women, the dry cough of an old man. All of it filled the hush like background noise to a tragedy. The parchment trembled before her, not from wind, but from the tension of 100 eyes. Margaret did not move. Beneath the veil, her face remained hidden, but her eyes burned with defiance. To sign meant surrender. To refuse meant rebellion not only against the Baron, but against the very law he had twisted into his weapon. At the back of the church, a shadow shifted. The man with the low-brimmed hat leaned forward, his face still veiled in darkness. He did not speak. He did not smile. His eyes were fixed on the blood-stained contract, as though he saw through the parchment to something deeper. The Baron noticed. His lips curled into disdain. "Even the town's ghosts stir at the sight of you, Margaret," he mocked, pushing the contract closer. "Sign it, or everyone will know your courage is nothing but unpaid debt." Her father pressed the pen into her palm. His fingers shook, his eyes sank. The smear of blood on the parchment seemed to grow darker under the colored light. And in that instant, before Margaret could make her choice, the air itself seemed to tighten, alive with the weight of something imminent. A silence that was no longer passive but charged, ready to shatter with a single gesture. The Baron's words still echoed when the silence shifted, as though the air itself had leaned forward. The congregation turned one by one toward the man in the shadows at the back of the church. His presence had been easy to ignore until now, silent, still, a figure carved from dust and dusk. But now his stillness carried weight, pressing down on the room like a storm cloud before the lightning. He rose slowly. His coat was plain, long worn by the road, the dust of miles clinging to its seams. His boots, scarred from hard work rather than polish, struck the wooden floor with steady rhythm. The brim of his hat cast his face in shadow, but his eyes, dark, unflinching, glimmered beneath. No words came from him. He did not clear his throat, did not declare intent. Instead, he lifted his hand, 2 fingers raised in a gesture that broke the air like a hammer strike. Gasps rippled through the pews. Someone whispered his name like a curse, another like a prayer. Kane. Whit Kane, the silent rancher. The auctioneer's hammer had not yet fallen, but everyone in Dry Creek knew the story. A man who rarely spoke, who kept to his ranch beyond Red Hollow, who carried his silence like armor. They said he never wasted words unless they cut deeper than steel. The Baron's smirk faltered for the briefest instant, then returned sharper. "So even the mute rancher thinks he can play," he sneered, stepping closer to Margaret, as though staking his claim more boldly. "Do you mean to outbid me, Kane, or simply stand there like a shadow?" Kane did not answer. His 2 fingers remained raised, steady as stone, a silent bid that carried more weight than any number. Margaret's breath caught. For the first time since her father had raised the contract, she felt the gaze of someone who did not see her as property, as coin, as collateral. His silence was not neglect, but shield. His stillness not weakness, but defiance. The Baron laughed, brittle and sharp. "Fine then. If the mute rancher wants to play, let him. I bid 100. He slammed a polished boot upon the altar step, the echo brash, desperate. Kane's hand rose higher, 3 fingers now, the motion slow, deliberate. The crowd murmured louder, a wave of unease washing through them. They knew what that meant. He wasn't bidding coin. He was bidding something greater. From the inside of his coat, Kane withdrew a folded paper, edges frayed by time, but ink still dark and unyielding. He laid it upon the altar rail before the priest. The Reverend's hand shook as he read the heading, and his face drained of color. "Water rights," he whispered. The church erupted in whispers. The only fresh spring within 30 miles, pledged in silence as payment. More than gold, more than land, life itself. The Baron's face hardened, his voice losing its velvet. "You'll ruin yourself for her." Kane did not move, did not blink. His silence was answer enough. And in that silence, Margaret's chains began to tremble. Not from weight, but from the first spark of hope. The priest's hands trembled as he held the parchment, his lips moving in disbelief. Water rights. The Blue Creek Spring, 30 miles of lifeblood pledged in silence. The murmurs inside the church grew restless, a tide of voices unsure whether they were witnessing salvation or madness. The Baron's smirk cracked, His polished bravado faltered into something raw and dangerous. He stepped closer to Margaret, as though proximity alone could anchor her to his claim. "This is folly, Cain," he spat. "You'd throw away the only thing of worth in your name for a stray girl? For a debt not yours?" Cain did not answer. He simply lowered his raised hand and reached, slow and deliberate, into his coat. From his pocket came not a weapon, but a key. Cold, iron, its teeth worn from use. The priest blinked, unsure. The Baron sneered, thinking it a bluff. But when Cain stepped forward, the church parted before him. Every man and woman moved aside as if pressed by an unseen wind. He stopped before Margaret, her wrists bound in iron cuffs, the chain links quivering with her breath. Without looking at her face, he slid the key into the lock. A metallic click echoed across the church louder than the Baron's jeering laugh. One cuff fell, then the other. The chains clattered against the wooden floor, ringing like a bell of freedom. The congregation gasped. Some shook their heads, muttering that Cain had ruined himself. Others averted their eyes, ashamed to witness defiance they lacked the courage to show. But Margaret stood taller. Her arms bore red lines where the iron had cut her skin, yet she wrapped her shoulders in the wool blanket Cain offered, drawing it around her like armor. The Baron's voice dropped, venomous. "Paper doesn't break a brand, Cain. She'll wear ours until her last breath." The words clung to Margaret, bitter as ash. Her father shrank into his seat, unable to meet her gaze. But Cain ignored the Baron. He turned to the door, each step steady, boots thudding like the toll of judgment. Margaret followed, unsteady but resolute, the chains left behind on the altar like discarded lies. Outside, the town held its breath. People lining the street fell silent as Cain led her past them, her veil torn, her wrists raw, but her chin high. The church bell rang again, but this time it carried a different weight. Not a call to prayer, but a warning. At the end of the street, a boy darted forward, barefoot, clutching a folded scrap of paper. His face was pale with urgency. He thrust it into Cain's hand, then vanished into the alleys. Cain unfolded the message. Bold ink scrawled across the page. "Bill of claim, Rosalind Hale, property of Crow Company." Margaret's breath hitched. The name was hers. The signature was forged. But the seal at the bottom was real. The chains had fallen, but the noose of paper had only just tightened. The dust of Dry Creek clung to them as they left the town behind. Cain rode steady at the reins, his posture upright, the brim of his hat pulled low. Margaret sat behind him, clutching the wool blanket tighter than his waist. She did not look back at the church, at the scattered flowers, at the contract dripping with shame. To look back would be to surrender. The plain stretched endless before them, a horizon of fading red as the sun bled into dusk. Wind hissed through brittle grass, whispering secrets the land had kept for centuries. Hoofbeats struck a slow rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, carrying them farther from Dry Creek but not from the weight of what had happened. For miles there was only silence. Margaret thought it unbearable at first, the quiet pressing on her ears like a burden. But as the ride carried on, she felt something different in it, not emptiness but intent. Cain did not speak. He did not need to. His silence filled the space with steadiness, as if words would only cheapen the moment. Finally, when the sky bruised purple and the first stars bled through, Cain drew his horse to a slower pace. His voice came low, rough, like stone cracking after years of stillness. "There are 3 silences on the plains," he said. Margaret stiffened. To hear him speak was like hearing the land itself murmur. She waited. "The wind," he continued, tilting his head as the breeze rattled the dry grass. "The hooves," he added, patting the horse's neck as the steady rhythm echoed beneath them. He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And the breath, yours. The land doesn't forgive noise. You learn the silences, you learn to live." Margaret repeated the words under her breath, tasting them, as though memorizing a prayer. Wind, hooves, breath. Her voice cracked, but it was steady. Cain gave the faintest nod, approval in the smallest gesture. Then he urged the horse forward again. They rode on as the night deepened, the blanket shielding her from the cold, but not from memory. Margaret traced the raw lines on her wrists where the cuffs had bitten deep. Freedom felt foreign, as fragile as glass. She wanted to believe it, to breathe it, but the paper claim burned in Kane's pocket, heavy as iron. Behind them, in the dark swell of the storm clouds, faint shapes moved. Margaret caught them first. A flicker of lanterns, the silhouettes of riders pacing their trail, distant but deliberate. Her heart stuttered. "They're following us," she whispered. Kane did not answer. His jaw tightened. His silence said enough. The storm was coming. So were the riders. The night thickened as the storm gathered its weight. Clouds rolled low and heavy across the horizon, their bellies swollen with lightning. The wind shifted sharp, carrying the metallic scent of rain not yet fallen. Kane's horse tossed its head, uneasy, hooves drumming a nervous rhythm against the hard-packed trail. Margaret clutched the blanket tighter. Her eyes, sharp despite exhaustion, fixed on the ridge behind them. Shapes moved there, 3 at first, then 4, drifting in and out of the storm's shadow. They did not rush. They did not hide. They simply kept pace, their lanterns bobbing faintly like watchful eyes in the dark. "They're not leaving," she whispered, voice brittle. "They want us to know." Kane's jaw clenched, the leather reins creaking under his grip. He did not look back, only forward, as though to acknowledge the riders would give them ground. The silence between them was taut, stretched thin as wire. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the plain. Lightning flared for an instant, carving the horizon into stark relief. Margaret saw them clearly then. The riders' wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung across saddles, faces hidden in shadow. Men of the Crow Company, patient as wolves. Fear pricked her skin, but she swallowed it down. "How long will they follow?" she asked, her voice a thread. Kane answered only by pressing his heels lightly into the horse's sides. The animal surged forward, muscles rippling, hooves pounding harder. Margaret gripped his coat, holding on as the storm broke around them. Rain came in sheets, cold and merciless, drumming against their shoulders. The lanterns behind flickered, blurred by the downpour, but they did not vanish. The chase stretched through the night. Lightning split the sky, painting the riders in flashes of pale fire. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, haunting the edges of their path. Margaret's arms ached from holding on, her legs numb from the saddle, but she refused to falter. At last, near dawn, the storm's fury waned. Clouds thinned, moonlight spilling silver across the land. Through the haze, Kane's ranch came into view, a square of wood and stone anchored to the earth like a sentinel. Fences stretched outward, ribs holding the land steady. Margaret exhaled, though her chest was still tight. The riders had not pressed closer. They lingered in the distance, shadows fading with the storm, but their presence remained heavy, a promise rather than a threat fulfilled. Kane slowed the horse to a trot, his shoulders taut, his silence unreadable. Margaret leaned into his back, her eyes still scanning the horizon. She knew what he would not say aloud. The storm had not shaken them off. It had only delayed the inevitable. Behind them, far out on the ridge, the lantern swayed one last time before winking out. But Margaret felt it in her bones. The Crow Company had marked her, and they were patient men. Kane reined in as the ranch loomed out of the silver haze. It wasn't grand, not like the Baron's estate with its manicured fences and shining windows. Kane's place was plain and weathered, but every line spoke of care. A square cabin of wood and stone, its porch sagged under years of wind, yet held firm. Fences stretched outward like ribs around a heart, corrals stout, barns upright though scarred by storms. Nothing wasted, nothing neglected. Margaret slid stiffly from the saddle, her legs trembling from the long ride. She clutched the blanket close, her fingers still raw from iron and rain. The land was silent but not empty. A water trough stood filled, tools hung sharp and polished along the barn wall, and buckets were stacked with neat precision. Even the wagon wheels, long disused, leaned straight as sentinels. This was no palace. It was a place lived in by a man who demanded order from the wilderness. Kane dismounted without a word. He led the horse into the corral, his movements steady, practiced as if nothing in the world could rattle his rhythm. Margaret watched him, the lamplight spilling from the porch, catching on his coat, on the curve of his jaw beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't glance at her, but his silence carried weight, a promise heavier than any vow. She followed him up the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath her feet, and she noticed a plate left on the railing. A steak half chewed, bone picked clean. For a dog, perhaps, though no animal lingered now. A chair beside the door, worn smooth on the arms, sat dusted as though untouched for years. The ranch breathed like something waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and earth. A single bed pressed against the far wall, quilts folded crisp. A scarred table bore the marks of years of use but gleamed from recent scrubbing. Jars lined the shelves, tools arranged with soldierly precision. It was a house that lived by rules. Margaret lingered on the threshold, the blanket still pulled high around her shoulders. After a moment, Kane lit a lamp and set it on the table, its glow painting the room in amber warmth. "You can take the bed," he said at last, his voice low, unused, almost rough. Margaret blinked. The sound startled her more than thunder had. His silence had been so absolute that his words struck like a crack of lightning. She stared at him, uncertain whether to argue. But the look in his eyes was not command. It was oath. No one would chain her under his roof. She lowered herself onto the quilt. For the first time in memory, she laid her head down without shackles on her wrists. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor, and sleep took her quick, heavy, and clean. Kane remained on the porch, the lamp guttering at his side. He sat in the worn chair, knife in hand, shaving curls of wood until the blade dulled. His gaze never left the horizon. Lanterns no longer burned there, but he carved as though shadows themselves demanded reckoning. Morning broke pale over the plains. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, the grass dripping silver. Inside the cabin, the fire in the stove burned low, crackling soft. Margaret stirred, blinking at the thin light spilling through the small window. For a moment she lay still, listening to the steady silence. No hammer, no auctioneer's cry, no laughter from the cruel crowd. Only the hush of a home. She sat up slowly, the wool blanket slipping from her shoulders. As the quilt brushed against her skin, she froze. A sharp sting spread across the curve of her shoulder. She tugged the torn dress aside, eyes narrowing. There, beneath the fabric raised against her flesh, was a mark, burned deep, dark as coal, not from yesterday, not from the cuffs, older, a brand. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembled as they traced the scar's edges. The memory of fire, of iron pressed against flesh, flooded back, and with it the truth she had tried to bury. She clenched the blanket tight around her, but the brand pulsed like it carried its own heartbeat. Kane entered quietly, a tin mug of coffee in hand. He paused when he saw her, his dark eyes catching the way she clutched the blanket. He did not press her, did not speak. He simply set the mug on the table and sat opposite her, his silence steady as ever. Margaret's voice cracked when it finally broke free. "It's theirs," she whispered. Kane tilted his head, waiting. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. "The Crow Company." The words tasted of rust and ash. "They brand us like cattle, lease women the way others lease mules. If a debtor can't pay, they take daughters, wives, sisters, chain them, sell them. Contracts inked in courts that look the other way." Her voice faltered, but she forced it steady. She pulled the shawl higher over her shoulders, hiding the scar. "That mark means I belong to them, no matter where I run, no matter who tries to break the chains." For a long moment, the only sound was the hiss of the fire. Kane's face remained still, but a muscle in his jaw ticked. He set the mug aside, rose, and crossed to the wall. From a rack of tools, he pulled down a long iron chisel, its edge dulled by years of work. He sat back at the table, stone wet at his side. The rasp of metal against stone filled the room, harsh and steady. Margaret frowned. "What are you doing?" Kane did not look up. "Sharpening." "For what?" He turned the edge toward the lamplight. His voice came low, heavy. "Chains don't always break easy." The sound of steel on stone carried through the cabin, and Margaret's hands tightened on the blanket. She felt the weight of his words, not a threat, a vow. The day slipped into dusk with a brittle calm. Margaret spent the hours in quiet tasks, fetching water from the trough, folding quilts, her hands moving by habit though her mind lingered on the scar beneath her dress. Cain worked in silence, repairing fence rails, his steady rhythm the only anchor in the wide emptiness. But as night fell, the air shifted. The wind carried not only the scent of earth and grass, but something acrid, sharp, unnatural. Smoke. Margaret stiffened. "Do you smell that?" Cain dropped his hammer without a word. His eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. In the next breath the glow came, an orange flicker on the dark edge of the yard. Then another, and another. Lanterns. Men moved in the shadows, silhouettes against the rising fire. The Crow Company had arrived. Not with contracts this time, but with torches. The first barn went up quick. Flames licked dry timber, crackling, devouring. The horses screamed, rattling their stalls. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. She ran toward the corral, fumbling with the latch. Cain was already there, his knife slicing ropes, his strong hands driving the panicked animals free. The fire roared louder. Sparks flew high, catching the dry roof of the wagon shed. Within moments it too was ablaze, smoke clawing at the sky. Shouts rang out. "Give her up, Cain, she's marked, she's ours!" Margaret froze, their voices burning worse than the fire. The scar on her shoulder seemed to sear anew, as if the brand itself recognized its masters. But Cain stepped in front of her, revolver in hand, his stance solid. The flames lit his face, carving it into stone. "Not tonight," he said, his first words in hours, low but carrying across the yard. The attackers surged closer, rifles flashing in the firelight. Cain fired once, the crack splitting the night. A lantern shattered, flames spilling at their feet. Men cursed, stumbling back. Margaret snatched a bucket, filled it from the trough, and dashed water over the porch steps to keep them from catching. Her hands shook, but she did not stop. Together they fought the blaze, one bucket at a time, while Cain's gun thundered when shadows pressed too near. The fire ate half the barn before retreating under their stubborn defiance. The yard stank of smoke and powder, the air thick with heat. At last the attackers fell silent. The lanterns drifted back into the darkness, their voices swallowed by the night. Only the hiss of embers remained. Margaret collapsed to her knees, coughing, her hair damp with sweat and ash. Cain stood over her, revolver still smoking, eyes hard on the horizon. The Crow Company had not come to take her this night, but they had come to send a message. And Margaret knew it well. The brand on her shoulder was not forgotten. They would not stop. Cain holstered his gun. The silence between them was heavy. Then he spoke, voice rough, certain. "Next time they won't bring fire, they'll bring law." At dawn the ranch smoldered. Smoke curled from blackened beams, the barn reduced to a husk. Cain shoveled ash in silence, his movements measured, each stroke of the spade burying both debris and rage. Margaret helped where she could, but the scar on her shoulder burned as if reminding her the night's flames had not ended. They had only changed shape. By mid-morning, Cain saddled the horse. He said nothing, but Margaret understood. They could not wait for the Crow Company to return. They needed help. They needed proof stronger than fire. The ride into Dry Creek was quiet, tense. Townsfolk paused to watch them enter, whispers trailing like dust. Margaret sat tall in the saddle, though her eyes darted toward every shuttered window. She could feel judgment pressing down, the brand on her skin burning beneath her dress. They went first to the sheriff. He leaned in the doorway of his office, hat low, chewing on a strip of jerky. His eyes flicked to Margaret, then back to Cain. "You bringin' trouble into my town," he drawled. Cain tossed the charred scrap of contract onto the desk. The sheriff didn't even glance down. "Crow Company's word carries weight, yours don't." He spat, slow, deliberate, and stepped back inside. The door shut in their faces. Margaret's fists curled. He didn't even read it. Cain's silence was answer enough. They tried the pastor next. Margaret hoped foolishly for sanctuary. The church bell tolled as they entered, the pews empty, the air heavy with incense. The pastor wrung his hands when he saw her, eyes sliding away from the scar that peeked at her collar. "Child," he murmured, "the Lord asks us to bear our burdens." Margaret's voice cut sharp. The Lord does not brand his children like cattle, but he only lowered his eyes. There is no sanctuary from paper sealed by law. They left before her rage could boil over. Door after door closed. Merchants turned their signs to shut. Neighbors who once shared bread now pulled curtains. In every face, Margaret read the same thing: fear. The Crow Company's shadow stretched farther than fire, deeper than the brand. Finally, they stopped at the blacksmith's forge. The man was old, skin leathered from heat and years, his hands thick as hammers. When Cain set the blood-stained contract on his anvil, the blacksmith leaned close, his eyes narrowed. He traced the ink with a soot-darkened finger, then grunted. "This seal," he said, voice gravel rough. "It's shallow, inked, not pressed, a trick of paint, no true mark of law." Margaret's breath caught. Proof. At last, proof. The blacksmith met Cain's gaze, then hers. But truth don't weigh much in Dry Creek. If you want justice, you'll need more than a forge and a word. The hammer rang once against the anvil, sharp as judgment. Margaret felt the sound in her bones. The town had turned its back, but in that strike, she heard another path. One that would end not with mercy, but with confrontation. By midday, the sun beat mercilessly upon Dry Creek, baking the dust into hard clay and drawing the townsfolk into the open square. They gathered not for celebration, but because whispers had spread faster than fire. Cain, the silent rancher, was bringing a claim against the Crow Company. Curiosity and fear pulled every soul to witness what many believed impossible. Cain walked at the front, the forged contract in his hand. The paper darkened with soot and blood. Margaret strode beside him, the blanket still draped around her shoulders. Her chin lifted, though her wrists still bore the faint red scars of chains. She felt their eyes on her, eyes that once turned away in shame, now burning with uneasy hunger. At the steps of the courthouse, Cain stopped. He said nothing. Instead, he placed the contract upon the stone railing for all to see. The parchment looked fragile under the wide sky, a weak thing compared to the muscle and rifles of the company. Yet its presence there, in the open, carried weight.